Good morning. So we're still talking about memory today, and we're going to be doing a little bit of a review. What we talked about last time is that encoding, storage, and retrieval are the three elements that you need to remember about, well, memory.
Stop shooting at my house.
Memory is a tricky topic because it's inextricable from learning. We just discussed learning in the last chapter, and we saw that there was classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning as well as observational learning. Memory, on the other hand, has three different things as well, three different types. It's got procedural, for example, all the procedures you just saw me go through in terms of getting my coffee, putting some half and half in it, closing the fridge. I don't need any extra brain power to do those things because they're almost on a retrieval loop like autopilot. We call those procedural things. You know, tying your shoe, riding a bicycle. Those are procedural memories and you don't need any extra brain power for them. Two other types of memory that we can retrieve from long-term memory are, say, semantic memory. Semantic memory might be like, hot water is down, cold water is up. Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. I'm allergic to walnuts. I don't remember when I learned that cold is up and hot is down, but I know those things and I can retrieve them. I don't remember when I learned that Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States, but I can remember it. Those are called semantic memories. And it has to do with your whole fund of knowledge. All the things that you've learned in your life is semantic knowledge if you don't really remember when you learned it, but you remember that particular thing. And the last one is episodic. So episodic. Now, episodic memory has to do with episodes of your life. Things that happen in your daily life and really stories, if you will. Episodes, like a story I just told. I just told the story of getting up, making coffee, teaching, coming out here to where I'm lecturing. That's an element or a story. Now, I do this most mornings, so it's not like this one's a particularly special one for me because it's so often done. It's almost procedural, right? It's not like there was a particular story, but if I got up and there was, ants all over the coffee, I might remember that particularly because it's different. Other thing about memory is that our brains are looking for uniqueness. They're looking for this element that separates some other memory from everything else. Otherwise, we kind of collapse everything into a schema. Morning activities. What do? I get up, I make coffee, feed the cat. You missed me feeding the cat. I haven't fed the dog yet. I got to go do that in a second. But these are all the procedures I do every morning, so I don't really remember them particularly. They kind of get washed into a bigger, larger lump of what do you do in the morning sort of knowledge bit. That schema, as the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget determined, is what we use in our memory systems to be able to think. Because if you had to remember every single morning you got up and every single coffee you made and every single cat you fed or dog you fed, or kids, I got to feed them too. If you had to remember all of that, it would be overwhelming and you wouldn't know where to go. And also, why is it important to remember something if it's so similar to something else? Isn't it really important to remember the special things? We'll talk about flashbulb memories in a bit. So Elizabeth Loftus's work about false memories is really enriching. It enriches our understanding of how memory works. And I told you the story about my father and not actually having been to Mesa Verde, but he believed it so much, it was so rich to him, that he actually went there with his boys, and Dr. Loftus talks about in the book about how her false memory made her have real emotional consequences. She studied that and did a really interesting thing. She took college students, she's a professor at University of Washington, and she contacted their parents and then asked a bunch of questions and then had them come into the lab, the research lab, and had them read stories from their childhood. But one of those stories she interjected was a false story that she knew. She had contacted the parents and found out that had not happened to that child. And what was really interesting was it was a story about getting lost in a mall as a child. And it followed the same script. Everybody got the same story, and it interjected the same story, so there was only that one variable that was changed. The other stories were real stories that had happened to each individual in their young development. And what she found is that she could make, almost half of them believe, just having read once that this story had happened to them, they would come back and report it as one of the things that had happened to them. Remember that she had contacted the parents. This hadn't happened to them. They had not gotten lost in the mall as a child. And yet, with one interjection, with one suggestion, with one little plant, it turns out you'll believe anything. Now, maybe if I said that you were abducted by aliens, something that couldn't possibly happen, it'd be easy for you to fend that off, but getting lost in a mall as a child sounds like something that could happen. And so it's plausible. Loftus, as you heard in the video, is really interested in a therapy that was happening in the late 80s, early 90s that was about recovering repressed memories. So repression has to do, the idea of repression is an ego defense mechanism that Freud talks about. But the repressed memory recovery thing was not Freudian. It was a new iteration all of itself, and therapists were helping people recover memories that they had repressed. Things that had happened to them that were so ego dystonic. That means that it was so it was so traumatic. We would say it was PTSD of sorts now. The lingo changes, but the humans are the same. Was so traumatic to them that they repressed these memories, and the therapists would help them reimagine them. And what ended up happening was a real travesty in that women in their 40s, 50s had started to recover memories of early childhood sex abuse. But they weren't real. But the women felt they were real. And because they felt they were real, right, their belief in them, beliefs are rules for action. If you found out you had been sexually abused and you had repressed that your whole life, what do you think you should do? What do you think you should do? You should report that. You should prosecute that. And this was a thing that was happening in the late 80s, early 90s. And people were prosecuting their fathers, their 85-year-old fathers who had never sexually abused them. Maybe they weren't great dads, maybe they had some other problems, but there was no evidence of childhood sex abuse in these children. But the suggestion that it happened, 40 years later, was enough to prosecute these men. Some of them went to jail on accusations by one repressed memory, so-called repressed memory. That's a real travesty. Dr. Loftus really fights against that, using that in the in the criminal justice system. Recovered memories has now been really handed its definitive blow. You can't use recovered memories to prosecute somebody, but that doesn't mean that tragic things didn't happen as a result of using those in our previous iterations. It was a mistake for the courts to allow that type of testimony, and they don't allow it anymore. So there's now case law that's not going to allow you to recover memory of something that happened. And this is a situation where you hear the term statute of limitations. Statute of limitations should apply in some situations, because the further you go away from it, the more your memory gets manipulated. And so you aren't an accurate identifier of things. Loftus did other work about memory where she showed that people who were given suggestions through an interviewer giving them suggestions about something they had witnessed. In this case, it was they all saw the same video of a automobile accident. And if she had said, "How fast do you think the cars were going when they smashed together?" or "How fast do you think the cars were going when they bumped into each other?" Something like that. I manipulated the words. Now, they all saw the same video, but in manipulating the words, what ends up happening is people's estimations of the intensity of the same crash changes dramatically. And so you're setting people up with giving them the verbiage, giving them the context to take that memory and then to manipulate it, right? It's the same stimulus, same video. The different context is you're telling some of them that the cars smashed into each other and some of them the cars bumped into each other. I don't think those are the words, but you get the idea that bumped. What it ended up doing was it made people believe that the cars were going much slower. Crashed made the people think that the cars were going much faster, and smashed was even bigger. And people reported elements or details that didn't occur when the more robust emotional language like crashed or smashed was used. People reported seeing the broken glass when there was none of that in a video. So we need to be careful about our eyewitness testimony and how we understand people's ability to remember things that happen. There's some evidence about how people, when they feel traumatized or when their central nervous system is stimulated, that they don't recall details as well. When you see someone's life threatened or your own life is threatened, your ability to recall details is diminished compared to when you're, perfectly relaxed and not stressed out beyond all means. If there's a gun in your face, you're going to fail the memory test, so to speak. When you consider those things, it changes our societally perception our society holds, which is that the witness is an accurate recorder of what happened. And what you should understand about memory is that memory isn't an accurate reflection of what happened. It's your reflection of what happened. It's your experience. I hate the term lived experience because the way we use it in society, but it's a very accurate understanding that everybody's subjective experiences are predicated on your context is different than anyone else's. I don't care if you're an identical twin raised in the same household. You have a unique human experience, and that unique human experience is going to shade things a different way than anyone else. No one has the same experience. You are all snowflakes, and I'm not using that term in the pejorative sense, but in the unique sense that you're an individual. No one's like you. And your perception of things means that nobody else has that perception. It's unique to you. I believe that type of diversity is a good thing. We need to model our criminal justice system around how people's minds and memories actually work, rather than try to make their memories work better than they actually do. The Innocence Project is a system where law students will volunteer and they'll go back and they'll review cases where people claim innocence and the evidence that was used to convict them was shoddy or subpar or not sufficient in most case law. And what we found a lot of times is that people have been convicted of crimes based on eyewitness accounts that later DNA evidence prove, right? DNA evidence wasn't available back in the 80s when this was happening. And so you don't have the actual ability to check to see if somebody had committed a crime. And people were convicted, and later DNA evidence exonerated those people and proved that they could not have been the one to have committed that crime. So we have to be careful about memory. The next thing I'll talk about is something called state trait learning. This is a little bit more fun, and it also gives you less, repressed sex memories and people convicted of crimes they didn't commit. this is much more fun and also more applicable to you in your day-to-day life. So we'll talk about state trait learning and scuba divers when we start up again. All right, I'm back. State trait learning is a cool concept. Researchers did a wonderful experiment that I don't think has been replicated, and we should replicate research because psychology found that we need to replicate our research. But this one actually has been true, and it's been substantiated by related research. But the research I'm going to talk about had to do with scuba divers. So what they did is they took people who are certified to scuba dive. You have to pass training and go through some qualification to scuba dive. And they took let's say they took 100 scuba divers. Half of them, 50 of them, got their scuba gear on and went in the water. Now, they went in the water and then they were shown lists of words. They had a certain period of time. They had to memorize those lists of words while they were scuba diving underwater. Half of those 100 scuba divers, 50 of them, went to a classroom and sat down with that same list of words, and they then memorized those words in a classroom, right? So you have two different contexts, two different states, and half of the people that were underwater then came up out of water, went to the classroom, and were tested on those words. Half of the people that were in the classroom donned scuba gear and went underwater and were tested on those words to see if they could recall the words that they had learned when they were in the classroom, right? So you had two groups that switched the state they were in, but then half of the group that had learned underwater stayed underwater and recalled underwater. Half the group that learned on land stayed on land and recalled on land. Those poor folks who were scuba divers didn't even get to scuba dive during the whole experiment. But that was only 1/4 of them, right? What the researchers found is that the recall of what was learned was best when they learned it on land and when they recalled it on land. So the group of scuba divers who didn't do any scuba diving, they recalled it the best. You might think, well, that makes perfect sense. And it does, because when you're scuba diving, you're underwater and you have to think about a whole bunch of other things. Your mind is taken up with some of these safety protocols. Also, if you know anything about scuba diving, you have a dive buddy. So when you dive with somebody, you're scuba diving with somebody, you're not only in charge of yourself, you're in charge of your dive buddy's safety. So this is taking a little bit of your brain away from its ability to focus on learning, to focus on remembering something, so that when you recall it, you're doing the best you can. But the problem is that you're a little bit distracted when you're underwater. You might think that the second best people at recalling were the people that learned underwater but then recalled on the land. And that's not true. The second best were the scuba divers who learned underwater and were tested underwater. You see, even though it's a stressful environment, more stressful than on the land, your memory system works best when you have the opportunity to recall something in the same place you learned it. You see, your brain is focused on a whole bunch of cues. Our memory systems work with cues that help to signal for us how to recall that. The way we store our memories is through neural networks. And those neural networks don't just focus on that list of words, they focus on the entire environment surrounding where you're learning. Last semester, when I was teaching this, half the semester was in the classroom, half the semester was online. So my thought is, what a natural experiment we have now, that this semester I'll be teaching fully online, so that the learning will be done online and the recalling will be done online, and we'll see if this state trait learning from memory researchers holds true for us, that the state we learn in an online environment and we're tested in the online environment, you should do better this semester than you did last semester if you took the same class. Reason being, it wasn't like those poor people that scuba dived and then had to go learn on land, or those people that learned on land and then had to go recall when they were scuba diving underwater. That's called state trait learning. There's also some interesting stuff about not just your physical location, but your trait or how you are. And that's where the research about alcoholic intoxication and memory recall fits into this conversation. The book talks about people who are moderately inebriated recall better immediately after having seen something or having experienced some sensory perceptions than they do if they wait until they're sober to recall. You see, time, as we learned with Ebbinghaus, is really the issue with recalling accurately what happened. When we put all of this together, it helps us to think about how should we help people in criminal investigations. How should we help police officers learn to complete criminal investigations with knowledge of how human memory works? A lot of times, when especially in violent crimes, alcohol is involved. And so sometimes what will happen is they won't take witness statements until those people have sobered up. And this research about state trait learning says that there's going to be a more accurate recall when somebody's in the state that they learned it in, rather than sobering up and letting time move around those memories and translate them more into how our own stories go, like the two boys from Uglac, if you went and read that. So this is pretty tough stuff, because I'm telling you how bad your memory system is. It's not actually bad. It's wonderful. The best thing that your memory system is highly efficient at doing is forgetting. That might not be what you want. You might want to be somebody who remembers everything, like the girl in the book who can remember, her skim caramel macchiato at Starbucks when she was 13. I forget what it was, but she remembered some drink she had on a Thursday. You don't actually want that. There's a great book by Alexander Luria called The Mind of a Mnemonist. Mnemonist is spelled M-N, like a mnemonic device. The Mind of a Mnemonist by Alexander Luria documents a particular gentleman in Alexander Luria is a Russian scientist. So again, we got Pavlov and then you got Luria. Really, really good science in Russia. And this guy's the father of neuropsychology, Alexander Luria. And he met a patient who he studied over years. He kept testing this guy years and years and years. What he found was the guy could memorize anything. He was so good at memorization. The story goes that, Luria is reading this guy a list of hundreds of words long. Guy has no problem recalling the list top to bottom, bottom to top, or you can start in the middle and have him just go through. And Luria has been testing this guy for a year. He makes no mistakes in memory. It's insane how good this guy's memory is. And one day he made a mistake. And he made the mistake because Luria's saying, okay, recall the list, and the guy recalls the list, and then Luria's surprised. He goes, you missed one! Wow! And then the guy starts laughing. He thinks back, and he goes, I know what it is. It's an egg. And Luria's like, how did you know your error? He said, well, what he does is he takes walks around his neighborhood. He gets bored when you read him list of words. He's a person. He's not some robot. So he gets bored, and the way he does it in his mind is he takes a walk. And as he's walking, Luria says a word like dog. And so the guy will put a dog in his walk, in his visualization of his walk, he'll put a dog there. And then Luria will say egg. And he'll take an egg and he'll put it right on his walk as he's walking down the street. What had happened was, in his mind, he was walking down a street and there's a white picket fence. And when Luria said egg, he took the white egg and put it on the picket fence. And then when he's walking in his mind back through to recall it, he visually didn't see the egg. But as he went back through his mind, his memory, his storage, his encoding was correct. The recall was problematic because of his strategy. So how do you go about remembering things is an important consideration. How do you recall things? A lot of people think that they have problems with memory. You probably don't, but there's a variety of people who have better memory than you, and there's a variety of people who have less good memory than you. Like any human trait, there's variation. It's diverse. That's a good thing. I think I remember our conversations better than my wife does. I probably don't, because that's only to benefit my points, right? I probably forget the things I said that were stupid or not true or wrong. and I remember all the things I said. There were excellent points that clearly made my statement correct. What should you do in terms of recall? Let's say you have problems remembering people's names. For example, my son, who had the tick in his head, he came up here and I told you his name. And if you haven't recalled it... Okay, now we're going to talk about amnesia. So amnesia, people use that term like correlation. They use it for things like simple forgetting. But amnesia is actual disorder of memory. It means that you are either incapable of forming new memories or incapable of retrieving. If you're incapable of forming new memories, okay, that means that in the future, if I told you something new, you wouldn't be able to remember it. So if I said, my son's name is Henry, the one that you guys have been trying to remember, you wouldn't be able to learn that. Now, if you didn't remember that, that doesn't mean you have amnesia. It means that what's getting in the way of your recall of it, because you did hear it, is either retrograde interference or anterograde interference. So things that you've learned in the past, maybe some other guy's named Henry, got in the way and so you didn't remember, or that you had never met anybody named Henry and so that got in the way of you remembering. Those are some simple things, but those aren't amnesia. It's just that there's a lot of things to learn, and if we don't accurately practice over and over again through attention in our working memory, bring things into our thoughts that we're keeping on board right now and practice them again and again through repetition, it's going to be hard to remember, to recall. But amnesia has to do with if you have some sort of a neuropathology. You have say you have a horrible head injury and you're in a car accident. That's what causes most head injuries in the US. It's not football, although football is the primary recreational sport for head injuries. A lot of people say soccer, because they head the ball. That's not where people get injuries in soccer with their heads. It's when two heads collide. The ball's nice and soft. I mean, even if it's going fast, it's made of rubber. Your head and another head colliding, going for that same ball, that's where you're going to get the head injuries in soccer. Let's say you had a head injury in a football game or a soccer game or a car accident. If you can't remember what just happened, right, you get knocked unconscious. That's what we call a traumatic brain injury. If you have a traumatic brain injury and you wake up, but you don't know where you are and you don't know what just happened. Let's say you forgot, the minute before. You don't even know how you got knocked out, but you got knocked out from something, a car accident, a linebacker that hit you. You have what's called retrograde amnesia. Retro means behind, right? If you wear retro stylings, that means that you're wearing, apple bottom jeans. Or for me, Z Cavaricci jeans. Or bum equipment or hammer pants. That's what we used to wear. That's retro stylings. That's in the past. So if you have retrograde amnesia, you can't remember what happened back there. If you have anterograde amnesia, that's the other kind of amnesia, you have problems forming memories in the future. So if I was to give you, say, that list of things to remember now, and you had a head injury, and you have problems remembering that list because of your head injury, that's called anterograde amnesia. That means you're having problems forming or encoding new memories. There's a famous case, when I was taking your class, they told me about a man named H.M. H.M., now we know his name's Henry Molaison, so Henry comes up a bunch here. Henry Molaison was a man who had, let me read to you from the book. I could just tell you about him, but I think it's the book says it well. So Henry Molaison, better known as H.M., forced scientists to completely reevaluate their understanding of the brain's memory system. From the onset of his amnesia in 1953 until his death in 2008, remember I was always calling him HM because he was alive, and so they couldn't release his name even though he was basically a ward of the state. They had to take care of him because his brain injury caused by a doctor who was trying to solve his epilepsy was so severe that the guy couldn't take care of himself. So HM served as a research participant for over 100 scientists, making him the most extensively studied amnestic patient. So he's the guy who all these memory problems have been based upon because of what happened to him. HM's brain troubles began at the age of 10, a year or so after being knocked unconscious in a bicycle accident. It's funny, I read that he was kicked in the head by a horse somewhere else. He began to experience seizures. They worsened, and with age, they eventually became so debilitating that he could no longer hold a steady job. Anti-seizure medication were unsuccessful in controlling his seizures, so, at the age of 27, this again is in 1953, HN opted for an experimental surgery to remove a part of his brain, the temporal lobe, just beneath the temples. Not really, but generally speaking, it's on the lateral aspect of your cortices is the temporal lobes. That's not where the surgery occurred. In fact, it's the middle and down part. So the inferior and mesial or medial portion of the temporal lobe is where the surgery happened for HM. The book doesn't say that, but it says this. It says, including the hippocampus. That's the key feature. And that's what we really learned about with HM, sadly, because it, ruined, his life. HM surgery succeeded in reining in his epilepsy. Great, wonderful. My previous world where I lived was doing neuropsychological assessments of pre and post epilepsy surgery patients at Columbia and at UCSF. They are much better now than they were, but we learned from this mistake. I've participated in over 100 surgeries, I think, and most of them were removing the hippocampus. Not all, but most. That's the targeted area, because it turns out the hippocampus, it's an area of your brain that has a tendency to become sclerotic. Just means it's kind of shriveled up and gross, and it doesn't work well. It also has a tendency, sclerotic tissue in the brain, to cause seizures, be the nidus, or the beginning, the ignition of the fire that spreads across the brain. In 1953, we didn't have good neuroimaging and PET scans to be able to go in and isolate and be like, that was the one. We didn't have WADA tests, invented by June WADA, that I used to do as well, where you anesthetize half the brain and then see what the other half can do, so that you know which side is the side causing the seizure and which side to target with surgical removal. HM's neurosurgeon took both hippocampi, his right and his left. Remember, you have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and so you have a right hippocampus and a left hippocampus. He cut out both, and that was problematic. Okay. His surgery was successful, but it left his memory in shambles. Upon waking from the operation, he could no longer find his way to the bathroom or recognize a hospital worker caring for him. He played with same jigsaw puzzles and read the same magazines day after day, as if he were seeing them again for the first time. So, I always think about that. Okay, so if you only had to read one magazine for the rest of your life, because you won't remember it when you put it down, it'll be fresh to you, which one would you pick? Mine is Slam magazine, featuring Vince Carter, Kevin Garnett, and Stephon Marbury from like 95. That's just a little tidbit about me. He played with the jigsaw puzzles, read some magazines day after day. He suffered from profound anterograde amnesia. Remember, anterograde is that amnesia where learning something in the future is now compromised. Now you might think, well, what about HM's retrograde amnesia? Did he have retrograde amnesia? No. He, in fact, remembered wonderfully the first 27 years of his life. And for the next 80 years, the dude, next 50, 60 years. I think he died in 2008 is what it says. He remembered his first 27 years, but didn't learn much else. That's not necessarily true. He did maintain working implicit memory, which means he demonstrated in experiments involving complex tasks of tracing a pattern reflected in a mirror with repeated practice sessions, none of which he remembers. Remember, the episodic memory is gone. He can't learn semantic or episodic memory, but this practice procedural thing, it showed that he improved his performance on the drawing task, learning it as well as someone without amnesia. So, He can learn new tasks. You could teach him to juggle if he didn't know how to juggle in his first 27 years. You could teach him to sew cross stitch. You could teach him to knit. You could teach him these procedural things that people do while they're able to have a conversation. You could teach him to ride a unicycle. He wouldn't remember the training. So if you offered him a unicycle, he'd be like, I don't know how to ride that. Because he didn't remember the story of all that training that you did in your experiment with him. He's dead now, you can't do this. And we don't take out people's hippocampi anymore, so we're not going to get any more HM. So don't hope for that for your master's thesis. But he could ride the unicycle if he'd done the training. See, procedurally his brain could learn that. So basically this is showing us that our brain has multiple systems for the encoding of long-term memory depending on the type. Procedural memory tends to be all over the brain. But semantic and episodic memory go directly through the hippocampus. Some interesting things about the hippocampus is it's connected directly to your olfactory bulb. Remember I said that the olfactory bulb is the thing that doesn't get filtered through the thalamus. The olfactory bulb goes right into the part of your brain that has to do with formation of memories and your emotional attachments to those memories. This is why when you smell things, it brings back memories so quickly. In fact, the woman who has that super good memory in the book talks about she can get drawn into elaborative memories of things that happened many years ago by simply smelling some Bath and Body Works perfume. That association she's made, the memory, the connection between that particular fume's odorant molecules and her experiences that she remembered are so powerful that it takes her away.
The traffic.
I can't read
The boss. The baby. The dog. That does it. Calgon, take me away.
I think all of us experience that with smell. Just imagine smelling. I like the smell after the rain, and it reminds me of being in my garage and having it rain outside and smelling the freshness right after the rain, or fresh baked chocolate chip cookies. What does that take? What memory do you go to when you smell? You can even imagine, you can almost hallucinate it. Your memory is so good of smells, you could imagine what it's like. Anybody had that experience where you're walking down the hall, let's say we're at school and walking down the hall and you smell someone's perfume, and that was your ex's perfume. Now you might think, oh, or you might think, that son of a... You will have very different emotional reactions to whatever the context is that you learned about that person, but the smell immediately conjures up really intense memories. And that's because our brain is set up that way. Smell, as I said, is for safety and for attraction, and it has very powerful ones. Not only a sexual attraction for mates, but also kinship. You can smell your own. You can't actually smell your own family, but you're very attracted to it. Some weird research that was done shows that people actually prefer the smell, the body odor smell, for sexual attraction of their second cousin. It's weird. But take my human sexuality class and we'll explore why that's a good evolutionary feature of how we connect our olfactory system and our memory to our mate selection. All right, so that's memory for you. Your brain is tremendously good at forgetting, but you forget all the unimportant things. What did you have for lunch last Thursday? You don't remember. You think you'll remember, but you don't. But what did you have for memory, or what did you have for breakfast? That's important, because if you eat something bad, you need to remember what it was so that when you get sick from it, you'll remember later that's not good to eat. Memory comes in three types: procedural, episodic, semantic. Procedural are things like learning to ride a bicycle, learning to write. Now you don't take up much brain power. If, say, you were taking notes right now, it doesn't take much brain power to think, how does a W in cursive go? Like, you know how to do that. It's just automatic for you. Those are procedural memories. Semantic memories would be things like, at what temperature does water boil? If you know that at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the temperature water boils, You don't remember when you learned that, but that's just something you know. That's a memory. That's semantic. Episodic memory is like if you remember your first kiss. Like that would be like a semantic memory where you're like, oh, I remember the whole story around that particular event. And in fact, you have superior details of it. The last thing I'll talk about are flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories are something that researchers in memory have looked at for a long time, and they tend to be around something that's very stressful for people. So if you imagine what was very stressful for people, well, December 7th might be a day for our great-grandparents that was very, very stressful, right? Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And the day that will live in infamy, right? They will remember, if they're still alive, they're probably not, but if they were, they'd remember where they were, they'd remember what they were wearing, they'd remember who they were with, they would remember what they did. Again, most December 7th of their life, they don't remember. But that December 7th, they do. For the next generation, it was the Kennedy assassination. And people have vivid memories about what things smelled like and felt like and looked like and sounded like around when they heard that JFK was assassinated. Or was he? I love conspiracy theory. I don't believe them, but I love them. Such great stories. I also don't believe in aliens, which we could talk about later. The next generation after JFK was probably, I don't know why, but it probably wasn't Reagan's assassination attempt. Probably because he survived. I don't know, but that really wasn't a big one. The next big one, I think, is September 11th. No, you know what it is? It's probably the space shuttle, when the space shuttle Challenger exploded, you know, with that teacher on board. I was watching it in my second grade classroom. I remember, or do I? So many details about it. I was sitting right next to Christy Roberts, and I was watching this TV that Mrs. Snyder, our teacher, had brought into the classroom. We had two of our classrooms together. The two second grade classrooms where all the kids are sitting around watching it. And teachers got really, really upset. And the kids had no idea what was happening. And we looked around and teachers were very upset. And so kids remember the emotion of their teachers, right? And so it was a confusing time for us, but I was too young for that to be a flashbulb memory. September 11th, however, was a flashbulb memory for me, for sure. And that was a big thing that happened that really everybody in my generation remembers where they were, what they were doing, what they felt, who they were with. It was pretty profound. And so those are flashbulb memories. Now those are all bad ones that we all share, right? Space shuttles exploding, buildings toppling, people dying. Those are terrible. But you might have other flashbulb memories, specifically for things that are emotionally very relevant to you. I like to think about my flashbulb memory is a day that you probably don't remember. It was February 18th. It was President's Day weekend, 2007. I was in San Francisco and I woke up that day and I went out for coffee in Union Square. And I saw some people I knew running. And I looked up at the sky and it was the most beautiful, temperate February day ever. It was like turned to be like 70 degrees. Just a light breeze, clear skies, clear blue skies. The water was calm too. You know, the bay sometimes can get pretty choppy. The water was calm. I remember all these aspects about that day because it's the day later on in the afternoon where I got married. And those things are really positive, very joyous flashbulb memories. Your brain also works to remember them, but because it was beneficial for us to remember the stressful events, we tend to focus on those ones that are dangerous or life-threatening, not the ones that are life-building, not the ones that are so positive. But yeah, you can have flashbulb memories for really good things too. And I have them for that day. All right, guys, that was memory. I talked a lot about it, but it's an important subject and it's misunderstood. So now you have a better concept of how humans do memory retrieval, encoding, storage, and procedural, episodic, and semantic memories, flashbulb memories, false memories, how we can interject memory into people by suggestions, and how we distort memory based on our own context. Hope you enjoyed the chapter. Next, I think we get on to cognition, which memory is really cognition. Different types of cognition. And so we won't spend as much time on that. Thinking, which we'll talk about a bit, and then also intelligence, which we'll talk about extensively. So I'll see you guys in the next